Yo, 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 Big D, rocking and rolling this Sunday evening on the Spunky Spectrum Sports YouTube page, Driving to the Top Productions, my personal Facebook page, and my Twitch page, the Big D 3300. That's the THE Big D 3300. And you know me, I'm the sportsaholic. I've got a brain, brain, brain that can discuss anything sports. But there's also one other thing I like discussing: hurricanes. And for anyone who went through Hurricane Andrew on this day 33 years ago, this morning would be one that nobody will forget. It's funny, I'm talking about the storm that hit the morning, but at night, but you know, before Andrew hit, things were different. You know, people didn't worry about hurricanes, wondered where they get the next hand. You know, there were no social media outlets. The Summer Olympics had just taken place in Barcelona, and yours truly, that being me, the Big D was just 6 weeks old when Andrew came. In fact, when Andrew was shown his way for a few days, that Wednesday and Thursday, it looked like Andrew's circulation was gone. It looked like Andrew's circulation had disappeared. And, there were rumors to this day, even whether or not the storm was truly a closed circulation, a tropical storm, or maybe like a tropical depression, maybe even a tropical wave. But in a way, Andrew defied all the computer models and change. And 1992 was a different year. Tropics, that 92 tropical season was an El Nino season, which is what we want typically because there's a lot of upper level wind shear, a lot of dry air, Saharan dust maybe, and all that prohibits storm development. Oh, in most cases, prohibits storm development. But Andrew found that one pocket, and once Friday came, not only saw an area to potentially develop, but the storm, instead of going because of some develop of a high pressure, instead of going out to sea. We all remember what Hurricane Aaron, when it went and then went swoop. Well, Andrew went this way and then went basically west for a couple days, and the storm may have gone a little northwest, a little south, but it ended up going more south. So, you know, you may think, why am I talking Hurricane Andrew? Well, to this day, I'm not sure there's any bigger storm to impact me than Andrew, even though I was not directly in Miami or Homestead when it happened. I just know so much about the storm. I know 8 years ago I met Brian Norquist, who was the WTVJ chief meteorologist and the person who got Miami and particularly South Miami through the disaster. And you know, in I think it was fifth grade, I actually dressed up as Brian Norquist. I actually wore a suit and tie this school. This is a true story. I wore a suit and tie this school, and it was fun dressing up like with the meteorologists. You see them wear suits and ties, and I should have got a sweater vest, but it's Florida. But you know, Brian Norcross in many ways I think saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives because he was the one who prepared um not only his television station but his listeners to an impending disaster. In many ways, I don't think the other TV stations even knew hurricane, or yet, a major hurricane would hit the Miami area within a few days. Um, Andrew didn't even become a hurricane until Saturday morning, and it hit Monday morning. In fact, I think it was the 5 o'clock update on Saturday afternoon when the hurricane watches were first issued. Shoot. And looking back on it, you could argue the evacuation should have been issued right there because with a day and a half left, and Andrew was already a 100-mile-per-hour Category 2 hurricane. And, I don't think the Hurricane Center was necessarily great with storm strength. And even that's a bit of a science today. I mean, nobody thought Hurricane Aaron would become a Category 5 hurricane. I'm not sure anyone thought Hurricane Milton would become a Category 5 hurricane. How fast it came. But in many ways, even today, if there's a Category 2 storm, the Hurricane Center always leans, what, generally a category stronger just in case the storm strengthens or expands. So if the Category 3 storms come in the area, prepare as if a Category 4 storm's coming. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case with Andrew. I mean, the one storm that happened during an El Nino season. In the Pacific, we all remember Hurricane Aniki hitting Hawaii, the great Jurassic Park movie with Steven Spielberg. Actually, the cast and crew went through the hurricane in 1992, but that's a story for now. That's another day for my Hawaiian adventure. But um, the greater Miami area is probably one of, if not the hardest areas to evacuate. I mean, as someone who lived on the East Coast for 3 years, I know how many people live there. And more importantly, how many people who A, have never experienced a hurricane, B, probably think, well, the storm's going to ease, storm's going east, storm's going west, storm's going north, storm's going south. The storm's never going to hit Miami. And C, there are a lot of people from foreign countries, Argentina and Brazil, and they're like, we've never dealt with hurricanes, so like, what's a hurricane? But that doesn't mean a hurricane is, different whether you speak Portuguese, whether you speak Spanish, whether you speak Italian. A hurricane's a hurricane. And Hurricane Andrew was coming. And, I think that Saturday night before Brian Norcross left WTVJ, he said, I'm going to go to bed now. And I spoke do the thing. Because we might not get to sleep that Sunday night. And he also said, tomorrow's going to be a big day, probably one of the biggest in the history of the city. And by, I think, 8 o'clock, Andrew was already a major hurricane. Evacuation were issued, the Keys, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. So even a day before the storm hit, there was uncertainty where the storm would hit. I mean, we didn't have AI models. Hell, people didn't always have cell phones. And you know, there wasn't such a thing as Facebook or Twitter or TikTok. It might have been dial-up internet. I mean, you remember the old school dial-up internet took forever, and plus you need a phone. So if you use the internet, guess what? Guess what? Your phone's probably not working, or vice versa. So, you know, it was a question. A storm hitting Key Largo is bad for the Keys, but but Andrew wasn't a particularly big storm, which might have been the one saving grace for Miami. It wasn't a huge storm. Miami, in many ways, have been very lucky with storms. I mean, I'll remember the 1926 hurricane not only devastated Miami, but largely devastated Fort Lauderdale and even into northern Palm Beach County. And 1926 hurricane is to this day the only Category 4 hurricane to make landfall fall in a major metro in a hitting a major city. I mean, New Orleans didn't get a landfall, but from Katrina, the 1926 Miami hurricane hit Miami, and Andrew had the opportunity to do the same or worse. The building code was different with Andrew than it is today. The pre-Andrew building code was for 120-mile-an-hour winds, which was still the strongest in the world. But you imagine a hurricane that was 120, 130, 140, 150, 160, and potentially going to hit the Bahamas. And if anybody spent time in the Bahamas or any Caribbean island, not the easiest to evacuate because those airports aren't necessarily big. Nassau's decent airport, but if anybody's taking a boat to Bimini, Nassau, wherever, Paradise Island, it's not easy to evacuate. And generally, what emergency managers in the islands would do is have people get away from the water. You know, Generally, wind doesn't kill people in a hurricane, but water is the number one killer, whether it be inland flooding, storm surge, or combination of both. Water is the main killer. Wind's not going to kill near as many people. I mean, if Hurricane Andrew hit 100 with 160-mile-an-hour winds, but yet Hurricane Ian killed far more people than Andrew, not because of the wind, but because of the water. And luckily for Florida, Hurricane Andrew was moving about 18 to 20 miles an hour. So that storm was gone. The storm really started hitting after midnight. By 9, 10 o'clock, the storm was either in Naples or in the Gulf of America. So, and a story for us. I mean, we were in Naples. I was a 6-week-old baby when Andrew hit. And my mom, actually, mom and I were talking about this today. And, I don't think we knew much about hurricanes. I mean, we just taped up our house. I mean, yeah, the old school masking tape that you have, or like duct tape. Yeah, that duct tape doesn't work in a major hurricane. Not at all. Not at all. And in many ways, it's, fortunate that Andrew didn't hit here. Where we live stronger. I think we were just north of the storm as it came across the coast. It was more Marco, Everglades City, maybe South Naples. We were just north, maybe like the innermost outer rain band. And of course, Andrew weakened a little bit, but it was still a major hurricane when it hit the West Coast. Although what Hurricane Wilma did in reverse, remember Wilma hit Cape Romano and then came zipping across the coast, really hit Fort Lauderdale. I think did more damage in Fort Lauderdale than Hurricane Andrew did in '92. And you know, I've it's always about evacuation. Looking back on it, I think the emergency managers could have and probably should have evacuated that Saturday night. Should have issued mandatory evacuation because Miami takes 24 to 36 hours to evacuate. And by the time the evacuation order was issued, it was what, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. And Andrew was going to hit sometime dawn or pre dawn hours Monday morning. So, and the worst news was with every update, Andrew was getting stronger. And unlike storms where, the where talking about an area, say a storm hits Savannah. Well, the Hurricane Center's not in play. The Hurricane Center was actually very much in play because the Hurricane Center was off Dixie Highway by the University of Miami Core Gables. And there was a chance the building could have been, maybe not the building, but all the electronics, all the satellites could have been ripped to smithereens. Maybe the radar would have been somewhere on the road. And maybe the Hurricane Center would have lost its capability of tracking the storm. And not just for hurricanes, but any kind of weather. You imagine if the Hurricane Center would have been completely wiped off the map. So I think part of the hurricane, a couple of the hurricane specialists actually went to Washington. You imagine if the Hurricane Center would have been completely destroyed and everything would have been, and Andrew would have been tracked from Washington, D.C. That would have been something. And, but, you know, luckily with Andrew, the surge wasn't as big of a storm. I don't know what it is, but you know, East Coast don't necessarily always produce the highest surge. Even you would think East Coast storms, particularly around a moon tide or a king tide, would be more susceptible in producing surge amounts. But with Andrew, the storm was gonna hit about 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, which would have been a high tide. And, of course, that Sunday afternoon, Andrew just devastated Luther Island, killed a few people, then weakened a little bit. Thinking went through an eyewall replacement cycle, and thinking, will that stay? And I'm like, nah, yeah. And true story, we ended up staying in our house in Naples. I don't know if we would have evacuated, but know, by midnight, evacuation was over and it was hunkering down. In fact, it was Brian Norcross. I actually have his book, My Hurricane Andrew Storm, and he did it on the 25th anniversary of Andrew. But as the storm was approaching, bands were coming, windows began imploding, power was flickering on and off everywhere. He mentioned you know, I think it was I think it was incredible how WTVJ stayed on the air, but while the other stations were literally blown off the air. I mean, So, yeah, I think it was Hurricane Katrina where WLOX, I don't know if it's in Mississippi, lost its roof. I mean, there was considerable roof damage in that building, and Katrina wasn't as strong, at least wind-wise. Now, strong, much stronger surge-wise and width-wise than Andrew, but Hurricane Andrew's wind was considerably stronger, particularly in the eye wall, and I'll mention eye wall particularly around Homestead and a few other areas. But no cost mentioned get him Skinner. Get everybody in the closet and get him and underneath a mattress. Now you may think, why a mattress? Well, if a window implodes, you want to be in an area where debris doesn't hit you. Even today, debris doesn't come in contact with you. So, you know, and older folks might mention, remember when people would like open windows because thinking if the pressure changes, that's why houses explode because if the pressure changes, that's why the window breaks or the house explodes in a tornado. But opening windows is the last thing anyone should do in a hurricane because that just gives the hurricane more area to cause damage. You want to cover windows. That's why today, people use either impact resistant doors for windows, hurricane shutters, or plywood. But for Andrew, all the plywood was gone. I mean, people still put up shutters. Even the Hurricane Center put up shutters. Shutters, the old school metal shutters. Yeah, nobody loves putting up shutters for 12 hours nowadays. Trust me, nobody. That's why we all have impact resistant doors and windows. For like, or the or if they put up if anybody puts up shutters, the accordion shutters, we could just close the hatch. Bingo. Very little work needed. It's what we did for. It's what we did for Ian and worked out just fine. But um, even before landfall, there are questions: is Andrew going to come south of Miami, north of Miami, or into Miami? Because Miami had not taken a major hurricane since Hurricane Betsy in 1965. And Betsy, I believe, became the first billion-dollar hurricane. And now billion-dollar hurricanes happen every Tuesday, right? Yeah. But about 4 o'clock is when Andrew really started hitting the Homestead. If anybody's been to the Homestead Miami Speedway, that'd be me. Or heard of the Homestead Air Reserve base. And Homestead was gonna get hit by a freight train. I mean, winds of 160, 165 miles an hour, but it wasn't just Homestead. I mean, Kendall, Prime, Cutler Ridge, now Cutler Bay, Homestead, Florida City, they were all going to feel the wrath of Andrew's winds. And frankly, it's rather amazing that more people didn't die. But again, as I said, the wind doesn't kill people. Storm surge will. And it was rather amazing that more people didn't evacuate Cutler Ridge because Cutler Ridge, I mean, if anybody's been on old Cutler Road, that area is a floodplain. And not just feeling the wrath of a Category 5 hurricane, but then surge coming off the water would have been devastating. And why anybody would have stayed in off Miami Beach where the water could have gone across Biscayne Bay and windows which were not impact resistant and probably couldn't withstand more than 80, 90-mile-an-hour winds, imploded. But plus, higher you go in a building, the more the wind climbs. And you have people thinking, well, I'm safe. The surge is not going to get me on the 10th or 20th floor. Yeah, but you're going to be left without electricity. You're going to be without running water or sewers. You're going to have maybe broken windows. You might have damage here. It's Florida in the summertime, so guess what? It's going to be hot and humid, and there could be looters. And we don't want another Hurricane Katrina, which nearly, in some cases, happened. And um, I I don't know why people stayed in condos, but and again, people are stubborn. They're like, I don't want to leave. I'm safer here than in some shelter a mile down the road. Fortunately, Andrew didn't produce a devastating surge from Biscayne Bay to the beach to downtown Miami. The surge was pretty much around the Burger King National headquarters and a few historic buildings, but nobody really lived there. Thank goodness. A little like in Charleston, where during Hurricane Hugo, where the highest surge was at the worst weather might have been in what the Francis Mere National Preserve. So I have a place at the middle of nowhere where it just affects trees. So thank goodness. Because I don't know about you, I don't want to get 5 hurricane hit in a major metropolitan area. No, thank you. But no matter where it hit, Andrew was going to be the costliest natural disaster in American history. It didn't matter if it hit the Keys, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach. Um, and by 5, 6 o'clock the hour, Andrew hit South Miami, the hurricane force winds didn't go out far. I mean, went out about 30, 40 miles. So while Kendall, the Homestead experienced the worst of the hurricane, Miami really avoided much of Andrew's top winds. I think the winds might have been 90, maybe gusting around 100, 110 miles an hour. Gust, not the sustained wind. When some, luckily, in downtown Miami, the winds didn't reach a crazy level. I mean, you imagine if Category 4 or 5 winds hit downtown Miami, not and a 20-foot surge, because that could go all the way to the airport for we know. I could destroy Port of Miami. I mean, people go on cruises now. You imagine the Port of Miami's out of action. That's the biggest cruise port in the world. I think what one out of every 7 cruises comes out, or either comes in or out of that port. So that would be a huge economic problem for Miami. But Hurricane Andrew was not done. After hitting coast, hit Homestead, head, and I think it's rather amazing people even called. I mean, you imagine somebody calling for advice with, I mean, with a window blown out, walls collapsing, roofs coming off. I think it's rather amazing people could call. And Brian, of course, was there, just calmly answering questions. And I'll mention my story with Hurricane Andrew in in a little bit. But WTVJ made a deal with Y100 to broadcast to simulcast, thinking can the storm thinking if something happens and people lose power, well, guess what? They're not going to have TVs. What's plan B? Radio. So, you know, that's why everybody gets batteries. You know, you might not be able to watch it. I mean, even today, it's not easy if your internet goes out. Maybe get a Wi-Fi hotspot, but people can tune into the radio. I mean, still have. I don't know if people have transistor radios or the radios with the rabbit ears. I mean, maybe boom boxes, but or you could turn on your call and hear what's happening. But I think the radios probably saved a lot of lives. I think people cared more about the radio than they did about their broken window. And for the meteorologists at the Hurricane Center, this storm became personal. There were a lot of meteorologists, whether it be at the Hurricane Center or working in South Miami with destroyed homes. I mean, the biggest storm of their career hit in their backyard. And the men and women covering the storm almost in a way became part of the story. I mean, I remember hearing a story about Ron McGill at with Zoo Miami. Funny story thinking about it, but Ron McGill and his staff put the flamingos in the public bathrooms, tied them up so then the flamingos wouldn't be flying in 160-mile-an-hour winds. You imagine somebody putting flamingos in a bathroom? Bathroom. I mean, just the craziness of that night. I mean, how many people got sleep beforehand? Not many. Not many. Thankfully, by what 7 or 8 a.m., the worst of Andrew was gone, and it was time to, at least on the East Coast, and it was time to start seeing what was left. Meanwhile, Andrew was coming here, and it's funny. I'm not sure we would have left because my brother and sister were elsewhere, and by the time they got back, it was probably too late to evacuate. And being on the road with a 6-week-old newborn, not necessarily the wisest idea. A Category 5 hurricane come. So we stayed. And true to this day, my mother says that Hurricane Andrew was the first night I slept through the night. I don't know what it was. I mean, maybe the change in air pressure. I mean, we've seen hurricanes lead to more bursts, or weather lead to more bursts because of a change in air pressure. I think Hurricane Andrew helped curb my sleep problems, and I sleep just fine now. Maybe not like a koala, but you know, I don't know. I don't know if this would have made any difference, but I'm not 100%, but I think there was some shady workmanship done with some of the structures destroyed because it was weird how some buildings were completely destroyed and others look like they had just been built. And that shows the difference good in good, bad, and ugly construction. Even today, you know, looking here in Southwest Florida after Hurricane Ian hit here 3 years ago. I didn't see a lot of damage from the wind, but there was plenty of storm surge damage. But again, buildings built after Andrew, or now here buildings after Charlie, they should be okay from wind. That doesn't necessarily mean they will be. If we ever got a 1935 Labor Day hurricane, all hell could still break loose here, but will generally be okay from the wind. And in many ways, I think Hurricane Andrew helped get a building code, not just for Miami-Dade, but all of Florida. Today the building code's much stronger. I think it's for what, 147, 140, 147. I don't know exactly, but by the time it was safe to head from under the mattress, Hurricane Andrew left an unimaginable trail almost entirely due to wind. Thousands of buildings were destroyed. There were houses flooded, roofs torn off, broken windows, cars flipped. Boats ended up miles down the road, and other other chaos happened. I mean, remember what happened in New Orleans 20 years ago during Katrina? Andrew was like New Orleans in many ways. And if Andrew would have hit today, I think people would be saying how the believe didn't didn't anybody get first responders to Homestead, Florida City, and all these areas. First off, I'm not sure. I'm not sure at the time Lawton Childs, who was the governor of Florida, truly knew about the disaster. There were no smartphones. There was no way of truly knowing what happened. Most of the media gathered in Miami, rightly thinking Miami was going to get hit by Category 4 or 5 hurricane. Nobody was in Homestead in Florida City. In fact, a crew, Kerry Sanders, who was a reporter for WTVJ, was actually in his car during the storm. And he rode out Hurricane Andrew underneath a metro rail. And he and his cameraman did a live shot from inside their vehicle with the hurricane hitting. It was like, hey Josh, yeah, low down. Hey Josh, you been through any hurricanes? Let me tell you, you don't want to go through any hurricanes. I know all the reporters say, yeah, I want a hurricane from my restaurant. I'm like, no, you don't. No, you do not want a hurricane. Hurricane. No, sorry. But in many ways, what Andrew did was also bring out the best in people. They were, you know, you know, um, you know, um, yeah, cons of living in Florida, yeah. And then people in Oklahoma would say, you know what, in April, May, and June, guess what? That's all tornado season. So you know what? California gets wildfires and earthquakes. We get hurricanes. Oklahoma gets tornadoes. We all get something, right? Hawaii gets tsunamis and volcanoes. So in many ways, I think Hurricane Andrew also brought out the best in people. We saw, rescues, people from also bringing supplies, whether it be from Broward or elsewhere as well. Yeah, Ohio gets freezing cold weather, I guess. Yeah, Ohio, yeah, Pittsburgh gets snow, but I'd rather deal with snow than a Cat 5 hurricane. And I've dealt with both. Um, But Hurricane Andrew ended up causing at the time $26 billion of damage. And by the way, when Andrew was hit Miami, was actually rated a Category 4 hurricane. I think like 10 years later, the Hurricane Center found out that that Hurricane Andrew produced winds of what, 160, 165 miles an hour in the Homestead, which made it at the time the third Category 5 hurricane to make landfall in the United States, that being the 1935 Labor Day Hurricane, Camille, Andrew, and of course Hurricane Michael became the fourth after it hit Panama City, Mexico Beach, and Lynn Haven 7 years ago. But Andrew became the number one costliest natural disaster. Only killed a few people. I mean, killed more afterward, but and then Andrew went in the Gulf, and you know what happens when storms go in the Gulf? They hit land. Everybody was thinking, is this storm going to hit New Orleans? Because New Orleans had not seen a major hurricane forever, had not seen a Cat 4 in forever. And, we all remember from Katrina, New Orleans has got all these levees. And this was pre the surge mitigation system, which basically, hopefully, takes care of floods and storm surge for 150 billion years until long until we're gone. But in many ways, New Orleans is probably more vulnerable or was more vulnerable than any other U.S. city. And with Andrew, the question was, um, unlike in Florida where we knew the storm was going to be heading west, the question was, when would that north turn happen? But because storms that get in the Gulf all turn to the north. Question was, would it go more in the Panhandle, maybe Alabama, Mississippi, going to Louisiana, right over New Orleans, or maybe more the Louisiana Texas border? Which, when Andrew went just west of New Orleans, and because of its size, New Orleans largely escaped Andrew and ended up hitting like Morgan City and what's the other one? Berwick, Louisiana. I think it ended up doing what, $1 billion of damage. Andrew calls like 25, 26 billion in Miami. And for only having one hurricane that year, Andrew became the one storm of the 1990s. To this day, when you think of Andrew, particularly in South Miami, I think the fear of you know what is in many victims. But there are some lessons learned. Buildings are safer now. The hurricane and post-Hurricane Andrew building code has made South Florida in particular much more hurricane resilient. But in many ways, we've not seen a major hurricane impact the greater Miami area, excuse me. We don't know what a major hurricane would do to Miami or Fort Lauderdale. And for that matter, we're sick and tired of storms hitting the Gulf Coast, but a storm hitting Miami and Fort Lauderdale would not just affect Florida, but infect the nation and the world. I mean, the Miami International Airport's a huge hub with people flying from all over the world. And in many ways, Coral Gables Business Center. I already mentioned Port of Miami. Little Havana. I mean, they're all areas that might not survive a Category 4 or Category 5 strike. And also Fort Lauderdale. I've been to the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. It floods when it rains. I think that airport's in an evacuation area. So you imagine what would happen if that airport's inundated with water. Some of those beautiful, pristine beaches, whether, you know, um, Deerfield Beach. I lived in Tamarack for 3 years. Now, Tamarack's more inland, but, Cool Springs, Fort Lauderdale, um, what's that one area? Pompano Beach, thank you. Pompano Beach is one that's very close to the water, and on the East Coast, the evacuation zones are generally US 1, A1A, and 95. If you're east of those, you're probably one of those, you're probably in an evacuation zone. And my fear is that if a hurricane comes to Miami or Tampa, people are going to say, even last year with Milton, that's not the worst that could ever happen. You imagine a category 4 or category 5 goes into Tampa or goes into Miami or Fort Lauderdale. Um, it, it's a risk we have. Yeah, we all love Florida, but nobody wants a hurricane. And hopefully, the good Lord gives us 133 more years of hurricane safety. I mean, yeah, we're going to have hurricanes. It's impossible for it's hurricanes here in Florida. I mean, we went 11 years, and now we can't go between storms, and now we can't go 11 minutes seemingly. Hopefully, hopefully we can avoid storms. I mean, how Miami's gone, what, 99 years without a devastating hurricanes beyond me, you know, but he wants to know what all the areas I think. Well, Savannah's been in since what, the 1800s. So I mean, you imagine Chatham County, Georgia ever saw anything. I mean, already mentioned Tampa, Miami. We've seen Houston. Well, Houston, Galveston. I mean, Houston floods way easily, way too easy. And if a hurricane, particularly a slow moving hurricane, Orlando. Now, usually I would say, well, Josh just bring up a point with Orlando. I do remember Hurricane Charlie hitting Orlando in 2004. But while Orlando floods, it's generally that flooding comes from water. So in many ways, Orlando's like all version of Houston. Now, Orlando's not going to get the 160-mile-an-hour winds of a storm ever hit Tampa, or Palm Beach, or Naples, but it can get crazy amounts of rain. I remember in Ian, Orlando got a ton of rain because Ian was so slow. It was the slowest hurricane I've ever seen. Fortunately, with Andrew, it was moving 18 to 20 miles an hour, so the storm was gone by 10 o'clock. But with Ian, the storm really started hitting about, you know, all day, late Tuesday night, all day Wednesday. Those storms are the worst because it's like, I could walk faster than this storm. But, you know what? Hopefully we can stay safe. I'm glad everybody largely escaped Hurricane Aaron as it went way off the coast. Billy didn't get anything here. But thinking back, I was 6 weeks old when Hurricane Andrew hit. So this storm is personal, not like what people experience in Perrine, Cutler Ridge, Kendall, Homestead, and Florida City. What's it like inside of the eye of a hurricane? It's actually calm. Josh, the eye of a hurricane is the exact middle of the hurricane, and if you get a tightly wound storm, a perfectly symmetrical storm like Andrew would have been, or Katrina before it headed to the Gulf Coast, the eye is perfectly calm, meaning if it's nighttime, you can actually look up and see the stars, see the moon. Or if it's the daytime, and I've seen videos where you could look up and actually see the sun. In fact, in Hurricane Charlie, I remember Todd Jakowski on air, first time I've ever seen or heard it, describe seeing that he could see the sun in Punta Gorda when the eye of the storm was over him. Even to this day, it's one of the craziest videos I've ever seen. An eye of a hurricane and having a live television interview. So the eyes, the calm part of a hurricane, it's the exact middle of the hurricane. There's a front eye wall. Generally, the part of the eye wall you don't want to go through is the right front corner, the northeastern eye wall, because not only excuse me, not only does that produce the most wind, it's got a direct motion over you. With so let's just say the storm hits Miami. You don't want to be in Miami North because not only will that area get the wind, but the direction of the storm but the forward motion of the storm will increase the wind. So if the hurricanes produce 100-mile-an-hour winds, storms moving 10 miles an hour, it'd be like having a 110-mile-an-hour storm. Plus, that northeastern portion of the storm will be where the surge is potentially at its greatest. So with Andrew, the surge would have been probably Cutler Ridge and by the Burger King National Headquarters. Luckily, the storm wasn't big enough and moving too fast for it to greatly flood Miami and Fort Lauderdale. But we all remember Hurricane Ian when it came into Southwest Florida. The storm basically made landfall in the same area Charlie did, but because Ian was bigger and moving slow, the surge was far greater from Cape Coral, Fort Myers Beach down the coast. With Andrew, the surge was really in a small space, but that's a that's a good question, Josh. And of course, second half of the hurricane, in some ways, people may think it's weaker, but in Andrew, might have actually been stronger. And the scary thing about the second part of the hurricane, the wind switched direction. So if you have a southeast wind, now you're going to have a northwest wind, maybe producing the surge. And also, it could be buildings that are destroyed. Don't have the vegetation or signage to protect your building. Maybe that wind's coming right off the ocean where, guess what? Now you have a broken window or part of your roof's missing, and now the wind's going to be coming right at your building. So what do you do now? And the eye of a hurricane could last 20 minutes. It could last, a couple hours. I mean, bigger the storm means a bigger eye. I mean, Andrew's eye wouldn't have been more than 10 to 15 miles, if that, probably. I think Charlie's eye might have been like 6 miles. Whew. I mean, even 33 years later, Hurricane Andrew still leaves a memory. It's funny. When you look back and see all the Hurricane Andrew videos, I remember Andrew better than I do storms that hit my area. I don't know why, but I'm glad we live with houses that are safer, and that's one of the reasons why I love living inland because we don't have to worry about storm surge in Bellaterra. Maybe we have to worry about wind and how about and electricity, but we can make it happen. So thank you, Josh, for tuning in, and thank you for tuning into the stream as I look back on Hurricane Andrew hitting Miami 33 years ago today. This is the Big D signing off for now.